So I think voluntary action at the end of the day will be absolutely critical to fill in a widening gap that's left by the erosion of federal support for climate action. And that's where we are. But having talked to a lot of folks in the climate movement over the last couple of weeks since the election, I think if nothing else, we're kind of an intrepid bunch and know that you got to roll with the punches. Otherwise, what you give up, and I don't think that's an option for any of us.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. If you remember, in one of our earliest episodes, episode 23, I spoke with Austin Whitman to unpack the meaning behind carbon neutral certifications and what they really mean for consumers, companies, and the planet. Since then, a lot has changed, including the name of the climate neutral certification. Climate neutral has officially rebranded to Change Climate. And in today's episode, I'm excited to welcome Austin back to the show and talk about what this shift actually represents and what's next for their mission. Austin Whitman is co-founder and CEO of the Change Climate Project, a nonprofit with a mission to eliminate carbon emissions by accelerating corporate investments in climate solutions. The organization manages the Climate Label certification, a mark of climate leadership for consumer brands. Austin has spent more than 2 decades advocating and building solutions for the climate transition across public, private, and nonprofit sectors. In episode 174 of the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast, you'll get an inside look into how the nonprofit is evolving, what their vision looks like for the next 5 years, and how the outdoor industry has responded to the growing calls for sustainability and climate action. From emerging trends in product design to real impact of carbon offsets, this conversation explores how companies and all of us can take more meaningful steps toward a low-carbon future. Whether you're a conscious consumer, a sustainably minded brand, or just curious about what's happening behind the scenes in outdoor gear manufacturing, this episode is full of insights on how we can better align our choices with climate action. So thank you for joining me once again, Austin, on the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast. For listeners that are unfamiliar, Austin and I spoke in one of my earliest episodes. I think it's in the first 30 episodes of this show, which is crazy to think about. And we were talking about the program Climate Neutral, which has since rebranded to become Change Climate. So we're going to kind of focus on that topic today, some of the changes that have been going on for you within the business, and then also the outdoor industry as a whole. So I think to kick us off, I'll have you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about the transition from Climate Neutral to Change Climate. And I'm going to say for listeners, if you haven't listened to the first episode with Austin, you might want to listen to it before this just to get a little bit more background, but I'm sure you'll provide plenty of that as well.
I sure will. Yeah. Well, it's good to be back. I think this is my first repeat podcast appearance. So let's see where to dig in. The high level summary is in October of 2023 rebranded our organization from Climate Neutral to the Change Climate Project. And we also refer to it as TCCP for short. And then this year in September, we announced that our certification program, which has been Climate Neutral certified, is changing to the Climate Label certified in 2025. So there's all kinds of details and, kind of complexity as to the thinking behind those changes, but that's the high level of what's going on. We were founded in 2019 at a very different time in some ways. So there were lots and lots of folks for the first time thinking about the responsibility that their businesses have to try to play a role in seeking solutions to the climate crisis. And frankly, the rules of the road have shifted. Consumer preferences have changed. The kind of the greenwashing and green hushing movement has really moved forward, and businesses fundamentally think about climate initiatives in different ways now than they did in 2019. So all of these changes are really a reflection of the many things that have happened since we launched. And we're feeling really good about the direction and getting positive feedback on the certification. And starting in 2025, consumers will begin seeing the climate label on products instead of climate neutral certified.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have been seeing more of that language around green hushing as well, which I found fascinating to follow. And so, with Change Climate and the rebrand for 2025, what is kind of your vision moving forward then? I'm sure there is definitely overlap from climate neutral, but how do you see making more of an impact under this new platform?
Yeah, so many of the sort of reasons why we started the organization are still very much, in effect, very much relevant. So we all along have believed that there's an opportunity to get companies excited about decarbonization by creating a clear certification framework that if the company meets the framework, they can then use a label to convey their climate actions to consumers in a simple and direct way. Consumers will get excited, and then the company has a motivation to really to have climate as part of its sustainability strategy. And that whole model, that whole idea, we call it a theory of change, that's still very much relevant. What we've learned over the last, 6 years of doing this is that as companies get deeper into the process of building climate into their sustainability strategy, they're more and more eager to direct the money that they're spending on climate into projects within their own companies and within their operations and supply chain, as opposed to putting money into what we call beyond value chain projects, which are things like renewable energy credits or carbon credits or a few other different types of instruments. So what the new framework for certification does is it creates a way for companies to get credit for investments that they're making within their own operations. And we're really now thinking of the entire framework as creating a pool of funding. We call it the climate transition budget, that a company has to demonstrate that it's spending on projects that will reduce emissions. And so, again, in many ways, the founding principles are still very much the same. We see that there's a huge gap in finance for climate solutions. There's just not enough money flowing into the transition, which is why we're not reaching carbon emission goals, which is why we're way off of Paris alignment, 1.5 degree aligned emissions reductions. And so because of this huge finance gap, we're trying to use the label to motivate companies to put money into climate solutions. And so then we get into the sort of what's different. What's different is what climate solutions look like can now include projects within their operations and supply chain, in addition to projects that are being done like renewable energy credits and carbon credits.
I didn't send this question to you ahead of time, so if you don't feel comfortable answering it, that's okay. But I know the next 4 years, especially in the outdoor industry, there is a lot of concern with the upcoming administration, which at the time of the release of this episode, they will likely be in office. And so do you think that will impact some of your goals? You said that we aren't really reaching the climate reduction or neutrality that we're looking for. So do you think there's going to be challenges on a policy level that impact your business?
There will be challenges on a policy level that impact the entire climate, all the climate progress that we need to make. I mean, there's no question that the US is in better shape now after the Biden administration had 4 years to work on its ideas of the solutions, and the solutions that they've implemented have been, absolutely just numerous. And in particular, the flagship achievement was the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which is driving hundreds of billions of dollars of funding into everything that you can imagine to decarbonize. And so we're actually on pretty good. Right now, we're actually on pretty. We have a pretty good foundation, or a much improved foundation. That foundation would have been a great foundation for the next administration, presumably the Harris administration, to build on. And we actually were looking, from a climate perspective, we were looking almost unbelievably good based on what's been done over the last 4 years. We are now looking unbelievably bad, or maybe it's believably bad. I don't know, but we're looking pretty bad in terms of the federal support, because a lot of some of what the Biden administration has done could be reversed pretty quickly by the Trump administration. The Trump administration will have to assess whether the political consequences of pulling the rug out from underneath a number of the projects that have gotten underway, a lot of which are in red states, whether that's politically damaging. And that's a whole separate conversation. But fundamentally, there will be definitely no new support, and then there will be a lot of effort to pull back the existing support on very dogmatic grounds, on things that frankly probably won't seem logical or sensible and will seem ironic to a lot of people. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that. So where does that leave us? It basically means that from a policy perspective, we're going to have to count on states and cities and towns to really look for ways to create progress. We're going to have to, frankly, rebuild a lot of the financial models of companies that have gotten funded and are trying to grow in this environment, because a lot of, one of the sort of hidden benefits or some more invisible benefits of an active federal government program is that the federal government will often step in to help companies get from, once they've proven out their concept, get from there to scale, and that government funding will be gone. And so there'll be a lot of rewriting of corporate plans to kind of make up for that. And then the other piece, of course, comes back to what we do, which is voluntary action. So the decisions that companies make to decarbonize, the decisions that individuals make to decarbonize, nothing can get in the way of those. It won't become illegal for a company to choose to decarbonize its operations, and it won't become illegal for a consumer to buy a heat pump, unless there's like some absolutely crazy out there scenario. And of course, anything is possible. But so I think voluntary action at the end of the day will be absolutely critical to fill in a widening gap that's left by the erosion of federal support for climate action. And that's where we are. But having talked to a lot of folks in the climate movement over the last couple of weeks since the election, I think if nothing else, we're kind of an intrepid bunch and know that you got to roll with the punches. Otherwise, you give up. And I don't think that's an option for any of us.
Yeah, and speaking of the voluntary action, so I know in our first conversation together, and then you also mentioning it now, that consumers and then companies do have a role to play in this climate action and climate advocacy. And so what trends have you been seeing in the outdoor industry for performing better in carbon neutrality? Or I phrased that super strangely, but I think you could get what I'm saying.
Just to make sure I do get what you're saying, I think the question is sort of what signs have we seen recently that consumers care how outdoor companies are performing about when it comes to the climate?
Yeah, that. And then also, like, how have outdoor companies evolved in the last 4 or 5 years to pursue better carbon neutrality, even if we haven't necessarily reached our goals?
Yeah. I was just at an outdoor industry conference that the Outdoor Industry Association put on last week, and it was a really good taste of how people are thinking about or how people have been, thinking about things over the last 4 years, 5 years, and how people will think about this next chapter. And I think, what one thing that was very, very evident was that nobody's deterred by change of administration. Everybody sees it as absolutely essential because of the nature of outdoor businesses, being so reliant on outdoor spaces, and outdoor spaces are reliant on a stable climate. So companies are determined and will continue to be determined. I think they expect to see headwinds. I think, it's impossible to predict what the short and medium term effect on sales will be. And I can tell you firsthand that when outdoor companies think they're or actually are seeing sales decline, one of the first things to really be put on hold is sustainability initiatives. That's not always true, but it's definitely sometimes true, especially for smaller growing companies. They're more vulnerable to sales volatility. But I think what we've also seen over the last 5 to 7 years is an incredible building up of the capacity within outdoor companies to capacity to do all the things that you need to do to make products with lower carbon. People who know how to buy renewable energy, which is not an easy thing. People who know how to choose and work with lower carbon materials. People who know how to build the relationships with suppliers that are approaching that are bringing new low carbon materials into the supply chain, and on and on and on, right? So the expertise within outdoor companies has really exploded within the last half dozen years. And I think that puts every outdoor brand on a really good footing to be able to take on this challenge, even though companies are not on target to meet the more ambitious reduction scenarios. It's still, there's a lot of horsepower there.
Yeah, and would you be able to share any examples of, it could be companies you work with or that you have observed in the outdoor industry that you feel like are making significant strides towards more carbon reduction?
It's funny. I actually don't have any specific examples at the macro level. In other words, like such and such a company reduced its emissions by 20%. Wasn't that great? And I think that's because most of the evidence that we see is really down at the micro level. It's, that a company like an REI or, a Patagonia or a Columbia, a company signed a large clean energy purchase deal. And that clean energy purchase deal was significant because it addressed, a third or half or whatever of the electricity consumption that company has at a certain factory, and allows them to now think of that part of their production as being zero carbon. It's those kinds of breakthroughs that I think are happening, and they're not yet showing up as massive reduction, as leading to massive reductions at the company level in carbon emissions. But they're all, each one of them is a really interesting case study in what companies are doing. So I know that wasn't a very kind of exciting and specific answer, but I think that's where we are. Honestly, it's people are in the mid to late stages of working on really important and exciting initiatives that are going to, down at the product level, down at the factory level, going to lead to, lower carbon production.
Yeah, it does seem like there is a rapid increase in the pursuit of carbon reduction. And you mentioned clean energy a few times, but are there other aspects of like company production that have a really big impact in where we can be reducing more carbon?
I mean, I think, yeah, I say clean energy really referring to anything, to energy consumption anywhere along the supply chain. And it's important to remember that of the 55 or so billion tons of emissions around the world, carbon emissions around the world, 35 or so come from energy consumption. So the lion's share of the problem is really energy consumption. Energy consumption can be electricity, but it doesn't have to be. It can be transportation emissions. So energy consumed within ships or trucks or planes. energy consumption can be tied to electricity consumption. It can be tied to thermal, to heat production. And a lot of production processes have energy consumed to make heat, to process raw materials. And so I think it's really important to remember that energy refers to a whole wide range of activities, not just, plugging your tool into the wall and the electricity that tool consumes. Having said that, cotton is used, of course, in a lot of outdoor products, and cotton is an agricultural product. And so, how certain agricultural products are used, how they're grown, produced, and what the carbon intensity is, that's important as well. It's not as huge in the outdoor industry as it is in, say, the food and beverage sector, which we work also in, but it's definitely a consideration.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so when we are looking at things like climate neutral or change climate, those types of certifications, if we're zeroing in on the outdoor industry specifically, do you think that this will ever become a standard or requirement in the industry where your company has to sequester X amount of carbon or has to be certified by Change Climate? Do you think that would ever be feasible or possible, or are we seeing it's going to stay voluntary?
I guess, I'd love to tell you, yes, it'll become ubiquitous across the industry. I think that the outdoor industry is in a really unique position because, unlike more general product categories, like let's look at organic, for example. Lots and lots of people buy food. Organic is really only in the single digits in terms of its adoption. You might walk into Whole Foods and see something like 50% of the SKUs have organic on them. But in a general sense, organic is only, small percentages of the total products out there, and organic practices are only used in a small percentage of the total acres that are where food is grown. Outdoor industry is different in the sense that we have, for the products that are made and sold in the outdoor industry, we have a smaller number of channels through large companies like REI or Backcountry or others. And I think a consumer base that is more interested in understanding the impacts, as opposed to necessarily the average person who buys a banana or buys a box of cereal. And so that's, that I think does point to the likelihood of a much higher adoption rate than, say, the USDA organic, because we'll see a lot more, or we are seeing a lot more interest among consumers in the outdoor space. People care more. I don't think it'll ever not be voluntary unless the government steps in and says this is something you have to do, in which case it won't even look like what we do. It'll just be a different set of requirements that's government imposed. But that's not conceivable, I think, certainly for the next 4 years, but I can't even imagine ever. But what companies like REI are doing is, building expectations for their retail partners that climate programs be adopted all the way across the spectrum, so that the expectation of a retailer is that a company that sells products through that retailer has certain certifications that reflect certain types of behavior. And that's already a strong recommendation right now, but it could become a requirement, I think, as time goes on. One example of that is the very rapid shift toward getting PFAS out of products, which happened not because of a voluntary choice, not because it was given voluntarily to companies, but because it was made mandatory very quickly. And so if something like that happened for carbon emissions, you could imagine that what you're describing actually becomes real very quickly. Now, would it apply to every single company across every single product? Probably not, because there will always be ways that companies can sell outdoor goods, not necessarily through the retail channels where that kind of pressure is being placed, but it could happen to a vast majority of products.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was thinking of, is like that forced shift that we saw with PFAS, if it could ever apply to this. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And with the, I guess, like focus in the outdoor industry on more sustainable environmental practices, even with that focus compared to other sectors of production, we are still facing a lot of challenges and we're not reaching our goals, right? So what have been some of the main hurdles that you think companies have to overcome or have been pushing against in order to reach our goal of not just carbon neutrality, but carbon, what is the word? Carbon, I don't know. I can't think of the word right now, but we have said it a million times in this conversation. Um, I want to say sequestering, but it's not. Reduction. Oh my Lanta. Okay. Carbon reduction. There you go.
Yeah, what's stopping companies from reducing emissions faster? Money.
Just straight up.
Straight up money. Yep, straight up. Consistency of investment in new ways of making things and bringing them to market. It's really just a question of whether financial support exists. I think it's one of the real kind of under addressed challenges in the climate movement, and maybe it's actually, if you look at the international climate negotiations that go on, money is always top of the agenda. But in the voluntary corporate movement, people are really afraid to talk about money. And my theory about why that is because there's this sense, well, if a company's doing something voluntarily, you shouldn't grill them on how much money they're spending, because it's nice that they're doing that voluntary thing, because we all know that they don't have to. But the flip side is that companies talk about all these things that they're doing voluntarily, but the money that actually motivates is actually really, really small. And so, yes, we should be looking, the gift horse in the mouth and saying, like, how much money you're actually mobilizing, because in a lot of cases, what we see is companies are making pledges and promises and setting targets, but not actually backing them up with money and investment. And that's greenwashing. And every single case of greenwashing is a case where a company has made a promise that they don't back up with real action. And that's because there's no money, there's no budget for it. So I think the real, obviously it gets takes a lot more than just, here's $1 million. It takes the skills, the expertise, the know-how that I talked about earlier. It takes willing partners in the whole ecosystem to develop, but none of that gets going unless there's a real, source of funding for the work that needs to take place.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Catalyst conference put on by the Outdoor Industry Association, and I know representatives from REI were there, and I think one of them had mentioned that we need to be building these sustainability protocols or like agendas into all of our business practices. So it's not like sustainability is separate and product design is over on the other side. It needs to be integrated. And so how do you think businesses or as an industry, we can integrate it into all business practices and then hopefully align with that funding?
Yeah, the remark that sticks with me from one of those discussions was that that every sustainability person needs to have a friend in the finance department. And I think that one of the best ways to build sustainability practices into many functions in the organization is to do that, is to have a through line that speaks directly to the finance, and that a finance partner, the person whose hand you're holding as a sustainability professional, is aware of and supportive of all the different things that are happening across the company to decarbonize. This is actually a lot of, it ties really well to the thinking behind the update to our certification for 2025, because rather than getting companies to measure their emissions in tons and then compensate for those emissions in tons. What we've done is we've shifted toward a dollar per ton or a money per ton model. So the threshold is that a company has to show that its climate transition budget meets at least a certain level in dollars per ton. So the budget is defined in dollars. And by defining the budget in dollars, we then create this we create this metric for the sustainability person to work with their finance team and round up all of the activities across the organization, whether it's HR, because we will count, climate action training, or whether it's the regulatory department, because we'll count lobbying activities, or whether it's the product department. We're looking to round up all the actions that will lead to decarbonization across the company and create what we think is, for the first time, kind of a consolidated view through the certification process as to how climate action and sustainability is being reflected and implemented across a wide range of functions within the organization.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Adventuring plans on your calendar? Remember to grab your Lava Linens travel towel on your way out the door. Founded by a mother-daughter team, Lava Linens crafts durable, luxurious travel towels as a more sustainable and better performing alternative to microfiber and cotton towels. Powered by flax, hemp, and tencel, they're designed to be by your side for years to come. Use the code OutdoorMinimalist for 15% off your next order. So, I guess to close out our conversation, what are some of the resources or services that Changed Climate can provide to businesses that are hoping to achieve these climate reduction goals?
We provide what I think of as really three different products. It's three different programs. And one of them is the actual certification. So during certification, companies are given the opportunity to pull together information on their climate actions and then apply for certification. And then if they go through the certification process successfully, they get the label. So the label is sort of the outcome of that certification process. But it's underpinned on what we call our standard. And so I think of our standard really as a separate or second kind of product, because companies could take the standard and start to integrate elements of it into their sustainability planning, even if they're not getting certified. And so there's guidance and education embedded in the certification process. There's guidance and a template embedded into the standard, which is available on our website. Anybody can go take a look at that. And then we have the third piece of our programs, which is the software platform, which we call the Business Emissions Evaluator, affectionately known as the B. And the B is actually a really powerful tool for companies to do, to start with carbon measurement, but increasingly we've added features to support companies in decarbonization planning, so reduction planning, to identify specific actions that they can take, as well as to set targets and to identify hotspots and communicate about the opportunities within their supply chain to reduce emissions. So there's a whole bunch of different things that can be done within the B, and that's the third program that we have. So all those things, are at different ways that we're offering them through partners, we're offering them directly to companies. A good amount of what we do is available at no cost. Some of it we do charge program fees for. Our mission is always to try to make information and tools as accessible as we possibly can. And so, yeah, we're just looking for more and more growth to the movement, and the hope that growth will lead to more impact.
Yeah, and what's the best way to access those initiatives?
Our website is a treasure trove of information. There are some links on there to pages that we maintain in Notion, which is a kind of a content management platform. In particular, I would look at the directory of brand profile pages, which list out the work that companies are doing to get certified. it's a great starting place to see how certification shapes the climate initiatives of the businesses that we work with. And from there, I would go and look at the page for the Business Emissions Evaluator, the B, which has a little bit of information on what that tool does. And then our Join Us page is a great way of getting in touch. And from there, our team is able to share other links about what it takes to get certified, and other links with access to information about what data you'll need to pull together to do carbon measurement. So anyway, there's kind of a sea of resources. I will say within the B, this is also important to mention, within the B, there's a chat function that allows people to access a pretty large database of just suggestions, tips, FAQ kind of content. When they have any question about how to do carbon measurement or how to put together these strategies, it's all pretty well answered within that.
Awesome. Sounds like you have a lot of amazing resources, and I'll be sure to share links to the ones that you mentioned in the show notes so people can find it really easily. But with that, Austin, thank you so much for taking the time to overview your switch from climate neutral to change climate.
Thanks for the chat, Meg. It's good to talk to you again.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.